Hello everyone. Today I want to talk to you about the United States and Russia privately setting out a 28-point peace plan for Ukraine, while the European Union is kept completely in the dark. Also, after reading The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, a famous book on Japanese culture available locally, it becomes clear that China must defeat Japan and make it submit completely. The culture of Japan as a nation displays an extreme duality, a love of beauty, yet a focus on martial prowess, valuing etiquette, yet being combative and stubborn. This dual nature, especially its negative side, often manifests in the context of China-Japan relations. According to Observer Network, citing Yao Jingxing, an assistant researcher at the China Institute of International Studies, the Japanese nation's admiration for strength, thinking that Sanae Takaichi always gives people an impression Japan can only be subdued by force. This mentality of revering strength has even deeper social and cultural roots. As a result, towards the end of World War II, when the US government began considering how to govern Japan after defeating it, these cultural factors were taken into account. In particular, should the Japanese emperor system be abolished? As a result, the US commissioned American cultural anthropologist Ruth Benedict to conduct a study on Japanese behavioral patterns and values to help the US formulate its post-war policy toward Japan. The findings were published in 1946 in a famous book on Japanese culture, The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. The chrysanthemum and the sword are also two symbols of Japanese culture. This also represents the duality of this culture. The chrysanthemum stands for the Japanese pursuit of beauty, refinement, and harmony, as seen in the tea ceremony, flower arrangement, and garden arts. The sword, on the other hand, symbolizes the spirit of Bushido, valor, martial prowess, and even the willingness to sacrifice oneself for the emperor. Ruth Benedict vividly described these contradictions in Japanese culture. She believed that Japanese culture is fundamentally different from Western culture. Japan is a shame culture, meaning it is a culture dominated by a sense of shame and guided by external evaluation. In a guilt culture, people restrain their behavior through internalized moral codes, but in Japan's shame culture, the emperor system enforces a strict hierarchy, and loyalty to one's superiors is paramount. Betraying them is unthinkable. Therefore, any kindness or favor from others must be repaid with a sense of loyalty. You can see that within the seemingly contradictory Japanese culture, a unified system has formed. Although Ruth Benedict's The Chrysanthemum and the Sword has been criticized for oversimplifying and dichotomizing Japanese culture, her research vividly highlights the characteristics of Japanese culture. This influenced America's post-war policy toward Japan, leading the US to station large numbers of troops in Japan and use military power to command the respect of the Japanese people. At the same time, the emperor system was preserved, allowing the Japanese people to continue their reverence for the emperor, while the emperor himself was in awe of the United States for about 4 or 5 years. On September 17th, the Japanese Emperor Hirohito personally went to the US Embassy in Japan, which is essentially American territory, to meet with General MacArthur, the supreme commander of the Allied forces. They took a classic photograph together. In the photo, the tall MacArthur stands casually with his hands in his pockets, dressed in a military uniform, while Emperor Hirohito stands beside him in formal attire. Who is the host and who is the guest? It's clear at a glance. The United States successfully forced Japan to submit to its authority, and through the emperor was able to easily govern the occupied country. In his representative work, The Psychology of the Japanese People, the pioneer of Japanese psychology, Takeo Doi, further explains that both the Japanese nation and individuals tend to adjust themselves and submit to the strong in the face of great power while adopting a distancing attitude toward the weak. This explains the Japanese mentality of revering strength under their shame-based culture. Rereading Ruth Benedict's The Chrysanthemum and the Sword today reveals a deeper realistic significance. From the perspective of The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, Japan's complete submission to the United States after World War II was not due to a fundamental change in Japanese values, but rather a logical adjustment made by their deep-rooted cultural patterns in response to drastic external changes. The Japanese shifted from a defeated imperial system to a new system endorsed by the emperor's surrender statement and led by the United States. They were completely subdued by the United States. This astonishing transformation, this total submission to America, vividly embodies the core characteristic of Japanese culture described by Ruth Benedict, an extraordinary ability to adapt to circumstances within a framework of fixed behaviors. When we see Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi displaying such flattery and deference in front of the unpredictable President Trump, it becomes clear that Japan's attitude of submission to the United States, though it may seem exaggerated, is not at all surprising. At the same time, Sanai Takaichi also stated that if China changes the status quo in the Taiwan Strait, Japan will send troops. This reveals a fierce anti-China attitude, so you can see that Japan is still submissive to China's strength. To the United States, Japan is as obedient as a chrysanthemum, but to China, it bears its military fangs. Now, there are even Japanese commentators coming out to say that China shouldn't use economic threats against Japan. But these people never comment on Trump unilaterally imposing a 15% tariff on Japan and forcing Japan to invest $550 billion in the US. Isn't that economic coercion? And what did Japan do to resist it? These people consider China stopping tourism to Japan and not buying Japanese seafood as economic coercion, but they don't see the US drastically increasing tariffs on them as economic coercion. That's simply because deep down they revere the US and look down on China. But China is no longer the China of the past. As researcher Yao Jingxiang from the Research Institute pointed out, Japan has ignored China's strength even though there have already been fundamental structural changes. Looking at economic strength, China's economic scale has already completely surpassed Japan's. Back in 2010, China overtook Japan in terms of GDP, and by 2024, China's GDP is already 4.5 times that of Japan. The scale of China's manufacturing industry, the completeness of its industrial chain, its infrastructure capabilities, and the size of its domestic market all far exceed those of Japan. Although Japan is still a developed economy, however, its economy has been stuck in a long-term period of low growth and deflation, with insufficient industrial vitality. While China's economy also faces structural adjustments, overall, it continues to show strong momentum in technological investment and industrial upgrading. Especially in the fields of new productive forces represented by the so-called New Three industries, China has already established a comprehensive advantage over Japan. At the same time, key parts of Japan's economic operations are highly dependent on the Chinese market, and China has long maintained its position as Japan's largest trading partner. Japan's industries, such as automobiles, electromechanical equipment, and precision machinery, have a very high proportion of exports to China, and their supply chains also make extensive use of Chinese components. If China were to implement trade countermeasures or technological restrictions, Japanese export companies would immediately feel the pressure, and its domestic manufacturing and employment would be directly impacted. In summary, when facing this kind of Japanese provocation, China has no other choice but to strike back, making Japan feel the pain both diplomatically and economically. In the end, Japan's attitude toward China will develop a mentality of admiring strength. At that point, Japan will realize that it can only face China with the same attitude it uses toward the United States. Would you like to talk about the latest developments in the conflict? Multiple foreign media outlets revealed on November 20th that President Trump is following an aggressive timeline to end the Russia-Ukraine conflict before the end of last year, forcing Ukraine to accept a new 28-point peace plan drafted by the US and Russia. The main points of this plan include, first, requiring Ukraine to give up the eastern Donbas region. The territory occupied by Russia would account for less than 20% of the Donbas region, in exchange for a small amount of land occupied by Russia in other areas. Second, the size of the Ukrainian military would be limited to 600,000 troops, which is essentially a reduction by half, greatly weakening Ukraine's combat capability. Third, Ukraine would be constitutionally barred from joining NATO, resolving the threat to Russia posed by the possible deployment of NATO weapons in Ukraine. Fourth, foreign troops would not be allowed to be stationed in Ukraine. Assistance to the Ukrainian military would also be terminated. Foreign diplomatic aircraft would also be banned from landing in Ukraine. Fifth, Russian would be accepted as an official language of Ukraine. Sixth, sanctions against Russia would be lifted, and Russia would be invited to rejoin SWIFT and other such financial systems. According to a report by the Financial Times, this would bring an end to the conflict. On November 20th, Trump approved this draft peace plan, and Russia's presidential envoy Dmitriev commented on it. Unlike previous efforts, this plan truly takes into account Russia's position. It is said that the United States is now pressuring Ukrainian President Zelensky to sign this agreement before Thanksgiving on November 27th. The goal is to have Moscow submit the peace agreement during this month's teaching period and to complete all procedures by early December. The Financial Times noted that the draft peace plan is basically consistent with Russia's previously known demands and even overlaps with the peace proposal Russia put forward in 2022. a Ukrainian official said. They said that Kyiv almost cannot accept this plan, as many aspects of it cross the red lines that Ukraine has long insisted on, and it is seen as heavily favoring Russia, very much in line with Russia's wishes. It's being called version 2.0 of the US brokered agreement. However, the EU and Poland were almost completely kept in the dark, only scrambling to seek details of the plan after the news was leaked to the media. They were caught off guard. A Polish official told the UK's Daily Telegraph that they were not informed about the agreement beforehand. Ukrainian officials then confirmed that the Trump administration had already informed Zelensky and his team that the White House was moving forward on an aggressive timeline, and that the purpose of this proposal was to end the Russia-Ukraine war by the end of the year. They are facing immense pressure from the United States to quickly accept this comprehensive peace plan jointly drafted by the US and Russia. However, on the surface, Zelensky has not outright rejected it. In a statement, his office said that the Ukrainian president had officially received the draft proposal from the US side, and that the US believes this draft could help restart negotiations. The process is almost agreed upon, with the goal of achieving a fair end to the conflict and advancing discussions on the terms of the proposal. It is expected that Zelensky will have a phone call with Trump in the coming days to discuss and explore the current diplomatic opportunities and the key elements needed to achieve peace. However, most people believe that Trump's timeline is extremely difficult to achieve. Even though Zelensky's office has confirmed receipt of the relevant plan, many of its terms touch on Ukraine's red lines. They are currently drafting a counter-proposal to submit to the US side, and Ukrainian civil society is also. This is because it is seen as a surrender or a one-sided agreement that benefits Russia. Zelensky had said on December 10th and 13th that any form of territorial exchange with Russia is unacceptable. However, on October 21st, he released a video statement on the X platform saying that the US had submitted the main points of a plan to end the war. He said, "This is their vision, and I have outlined our core principles." Both sides agreed that teams from the two countries are working around these key points to ensure that all content is practical and feasible. Even Zelensky seems to have softened a bit. It's unclear whether this is related to changes in his country's political situation. As the US put forward its peace initiative, Zelensky's own political standing began to weaken due to an increasingly heated corruption scandal. This scandal has already led to the resignation of 2 deputy ministers. Last week, Ukraine's anti-corruption agency announced a case involving $100 million, implicating several ministers, officials, businessmen, and even Zelensky himself. As more evidence comes to light, such as suitcases stuffed with cash, recordings of officials discussing money laundering, and even golden toilets in luxury apartments, The Economist has described this massive corruption scandal as evolving into the biggest political crisis Ukraine has faced since the conflict began 2 years ago. There are several points of suspicion here. First, recently, Russia's oil exports have become increasingly difficult. Russia is under increasing pressure from the United States to end the war on the spot. Second, it wouldn't be surprising if the US and Russia were secretly negotiating a peace deal for Ukraine. The real question is whether Zelensky can accept it. Third, who exactly exposed this shocking corruption scandal in Ukraine? Even drivers, are they involved in this case? If someone has evidence of Zelensky's crimes, could that force him to accept peace talks with Russia? With all this chaos, it looks like there's going to be a dramatic turn of events in Ukraine very soon.